All right. Welcome to the Episcopalian. Today we're exploring a topic that most people in the Episcopal Church don't think about until they suddenly have to deal with it, and that is the process of clergy transitions and how authority is exercised between bishops, vestries, and parishes. My guest today is Pastor Jacob Dell, author of an article entitled Debunking Myths and Avoiding Episcopal Overreach, Conducting Clergy Searches According to the Canons. Jake, thank you for joining me. Is there anything that you want to add in terms of a bio before we dive in?
Well, I mean, sure. I am currently pastoring a congregational church in Woodbury, Connecticut, one of the what they call ancient standing order churches of Connecticut. It goes all the way back to the year 1670. Current meeting house we worship in is from 1818, and it's just one of those beautiful New England churches that you see all over the place, which sadly are not in great condition in terms of the viability of many of the congregations. Just like in the Episcopal Church, these are old churches with old congregations. A lot of them, although by no means all, are liberal and progressive, and mine happened to be fairly conservative. It is part of the United Church of Christ, which is funny because I went from the Episcopal Church to the United Church of Christ. And in the Episcopal Church, we always used to joke that the UCC was Unitarians considering Christ. But my sense is the Episcopalians have caught up with the UCC, and that's certainly been my impression. So yeah, I was pastor of a priest in charge of two churches in the Episcopal Church in the Episcopal Diocese of New York, Holy Trinity in Inwood, which we used to call upstate Manhattan at the northern tip of the island, right near the cloisters. And then I pastored a small church in Millbrook, New York, called St. Peter's Lithgow. And so I had close to 10 years under my belt in pastoral ministry in the Episcopal Church. And before that, I worked for the National Church Office, 815 Second Avenue, in the communications and marketing department. And, left the Episcopal Church in 2024 because I guess we'll get into that a bit in the podcast. And I've gotten into it in other podcasts about, sort of the wall that I think a lot of conservatives have hit, particularly conservative clergy.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, pastor currently in a congregational church, but a lot of experience as an Episcopal priest
Hmm.
prior to changing denominations.
Hmm.
So, lest anyone be confused about that.
About it. Yep.
What prompted you to write this article? Was it a specific situation that you observed or a broader
Yes, well, I mean, it
pattern?
was in part observing my friends go through the process. It was also the fact that I was almost 10 years into ordained priestly ministry, not counting the time as a deacon, but the 10 years into it and still not a rector. And this goes back all the way to discussions I had in seminary or even before I went into seminary. I remember a priest telling me, yeah, the bishops are not, they're really waging war on rectors. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, they're using the priest in charge uh, canon to clip the power of the rectors. And that always something I remembered. I mean, I probably had that conversation probably back in 2005, 2006. So and then I saw it play out. Sure enough, in the Diocese of Connecticut, for instance, they have reversed course since then. But for a long time under, excuse me, Bishop Douglas, no one apparently was allowed to be called. No vestry was allowed to call a rector. Every priest had to be appointed priest in charge by the bishop, and then over the course of a 3-year trial period, at the end of it, potentially they could be called as rector. And I suppose that was a sort of managerial attempt to streamline the process. But if you look at the canons, it's totally uncanonical. It deprives vestries of their right to elect rectors. And I'm not so sure about Connecticut state law, but in New York state, where I did look into the religious corporation law, the rector, wardens, and vestrymen are the parish corporation, right? So for a congregation, for an Episcopal congregation to operate indefinitely without a rector is to operate in violation of that statute. And yet, the last church I was called to, St. Peter's in Lithgow, hadn't had a rector in 60 years. And so, usually, what that meant, they just had a string of priests in charge. Usually, when you see a situation like that, it's because it's a mission or a supported parish. But this was not a mission. This was a parish that had been admitted to convention. It sent its delegates to convention. So, a number of bishops from Dici to Sisk to I forget who was Grind immediately before him. I guess going back to Paul Moore's days, had just not bothered to enforce the canons and say, you're either going to be a mission, in which case I will appoint your priest, or you're going to be a parish and you're going to elect a rector and you're going to give that priest the rights of a rector, which include tenure. And the bishops have just not done that because it's to their advantage.
Right. I can't even tell you my reaction to that is I'm just astounded. Because yeah, it's my understanding that when you're in a transition period between rectors, that the bishop appoints an interim rector or a priest in charge, and the bishop has a little bit more of a maybe an oversight role during a
Mhm.
transition period because he wants to kind of check in with the parish, make sure everything's going okay. But that sounds like it's definitely an overreach of episcopal authority, and it's completely against what my understanding of the canons,
Well,
the
it
canon
was
law.
so the you asked the question, why did I write the article? And I will come
Yeah.
to that and answer it. In the previous case, in the case of St. Peter's in Lithgow, it wasn't so much episcopal overreach. It was the bishop simply allowing the vestry to have its way with and get away with having the status of a parish without without following due canonical and legal form of calling a rector. And
Hmm.
that was because the vestry liked to string its priests. I mean, it's like we'll keep you on a year-to-year contract here. We'll keep you on they didn't want a rector, right? Because a rector, again, is someone with real, not only spiritual, but legal authority. So it,
Yes.
it cuts both ways. Sometimes vestries overreach, and other times bishops overreach. Now, where I think bishops are overreaching now is with this priest in charge process, particularly as you saw in the Diocese of Connecticut, where we're just going to, tell vestries that they can't elect a rector and that they must accept the appointment for a 3-year period, and maybe then they can elect the rector. That's certainly overreach. Um, and in the case that I'm thinking of in particular, and I won't name names, but I was involved in a search process where the bishop aborted the process. She basically said that I could not apply, or I had already applied. I was already well along the path to an offer. The negotiations broke down over salary, and then when a couple months went by, and the vestry search committee contacted me again about basically saying, we think we can come up with the money. The bishop at that point sent a very formal letter to me and to my bishop, and basically saying that I was not welcome in the diocese, right? And that the process was over. And that's just if you look at the canons of the Episcopal Church governing searches, bishops have no right to do that. They have no authority to do that. The canons of the Episcopal Church, a black and white reading of them, a straight letter reading of them, not how it's been done, not we've always done it this way, but the way
Right.
the words in English read say that vestries elect their rectors, and then the bishop has 60 days to comment on it. And then the vestry can confirm the election or not. There's no veto power. There's no, you can only select or elect a priest from a pre-approved list.
Hmm.
And I don't think vestries understand this. They don't read the canons. And frankly, you've got transition ministers who are bullies, if not the actual bishop sometimes, who will tell wardens and vestries, well, you can't do this. You can't do it this way. And I don't know what's happened to churchmanship, and that's what the article was about. There used to be an idea of churchmanship. There are three orders in the Episcopal Church: the Episcopal order, which has its own house, and then the order of presbyters and lay people who form the house, the House of Deputies. Three orders. And what you're seeing happen here is that the one order, the Episcopal order, has kind of sucked in the other two. And that's just completely that is not what Episcopalianism in this country, Protestant Episcopalianism, was ever supposed to be. It was when the Episcopal Church was reorganizing after the Revolutionary War, actually right down the street from me right now in Woodbury, St. Paul's Episcopal Church is where Samuel Seabury was elected. So the very first bishop of the Episcopal Church was elected down the street from me.
Mhm.
And when the Episcopal Church was reorganized, particularly in something like Congregationalist Connecticut, they were appalled that they were thinking about bringing bishops to America. We had just fought a revolution to get rid of kings and bishops. And so the canons of the Episcopal Church were written in such a way that we would avoid the dread curse of prelacy, meaning we wouldn't have Roman bishops, the Pope's henchmen running around and telling churches what to do, that vestries would be powerful, and that presbyters, priests, would be powerful, and that together they would check each other. And what we've seen happen in the last half century is the collapse of that, and bishops taking on a prelatical role. And I don't know whether it goes back to the trappings of the Oxford movement and sort of this desire to be Catholic without going to Rome, whether that played into it or not. But vestries have really forgotten what their canonical rights are and what their role is, and churchmanship has been lost.
Amen to that. That's a great segue into talking about what do the canons actually say. So one of the things I appreciated about your article is that you start with the actual canons rather than assumptions, like you said, about best practices or how
Mhm.
things should work. I think at one point, you wrote in the article that like you said, the vestry elects the rector. That sounds straightforward, but I suspect many or most Episcopalians, especially people, unfortunately, like you said, people in governance aren't reading their bylaws, they're not reading the canons. They don't realize that.
Right.
Can you explain what that actually means in Anglican polity, that the vestry elects the rector?
Well, so the main the spiritual role is primarily the same between a priest in charge and a rector. The person is the pastor of the church. And you'll often see in letters of agreement for priests in charge that there will be a article in that letter of agreement that says the priest in charge shall have all the rights and emoluments, et cetera, of a rector except for tenure. So if you look at the canons, what does that mean? Well, the rector has plenary authority to determine the worship of the church according to the Book of Common Prayer, right? So if the rector wants to use Rite 1 or Rite 2, that is what is done. There's no need for the vestry to chime in or give its opinion. It's unwelcome. The rector has, or the priest in charge has, full plenary authority to pick the hymns, to determine how the church worships, to set the orientation of the altar, if you will. All of that. Within the rules, within the Book of Common Prayer, and whatever directives the bishop has authorized. So if the bishop says that the Revised Common Lectionary is not authorized, then you can't use it, right? But so within the rules that are set by the prayer book and the bishop, the priest in charge or the rector has that authority. And acts as the pastor of the church. The main difference between the priest in charge, therefore, and the rector is who he answers to. The priest in charge is appointed by the bishop and serves at the pleasure of the bishop. And I think parishes and vestries don't really understand that. The priest in charge is the bishop's man or woman, right?
Right.
And and whereas the rector is his own man. The rector has tenure. You cannot fire a rector. It takes two of three parties to remove a rector. The rector, in theory, can't even resign without the
Right.
acceptance of that resignation. So a bishop can't fire a rector. A vestry can't fire a rector. But a vestry and a bishop together can usually figure out a way to remove a rector canonically, usually for what we would now call a Title IV process, a disciplinary process. But that tenure factor is meant to protect the rights of the presbyterate, of the priestly order in the Episcopal Church. which means you can make liturgical and pastoral and homiletical decisions that might be unpopular and not lose your job. That's the theory. So uh, that's, I think, again, something that's been lost, but that is the primary difference between, say, a priest in charge and a rector.
Absolutely. It's my understanding too that a rector holds um holds an office that's similar to like the president of a corporation. In addition to being the head of the congregation in all of the spiritual matters and liturgical matters, but also legally. So
That's
that, I
correct,
mean,
certainly. And again, the only law that I'm familiar with is the New York State Religious Corporation law. So different states may have different statutes, but certainly in New York, the parish corporation was the rector, wardens, and vestrymen of such and such
Mhm.
a church, which again was why it was highly irregular for my previous church to go for 60 years without a rector.
Yeah,
Uh,
absolutely. It seems like that's just cutting off a parish at the knees in terms of their essential functionality,
right.
if they can't elect a rector.
Well, no
Um,
one, yeah, yes, exactly. Well, so if a bishop is, as in the case that prompted me to write the article, the bishop interfered in the election of me as a rector. The search committee was unanimous in its recommendation of me. The vestry was negotiating salary with me, um, but the election was never held. And then the bishop interrupted the process and forbid it from taking place, which was again a violation of that vestry's rights, as certainly a violation of my rights as a priest. Now, one of the other things that you might maybe have this, you want to come to this separately, but one of the other things that came up in the article was this idea of letters to missouri. I don't know if you want to talk about that because that plays into this as well.
that is a big problem. Let's go ahead and talk about it
Sure.
because that is an issue.
So, in according to the canons, priests are attached to a diocese, right? And that's actually
Yeah.
one big difference between the polity now in my congregational church and versus the Episcopal church. Once you become a member of clergy in the Episcopal church, you cease to be a member of a local parish. You are a member of the diocese, of the order of the ordained order, of the order of priests. My wife and I, when I was called to my current church, this congregational church, actually, according to the bylaws, had to become members of the church. So, we are members of this church now, this local congregation. Um, so the idea that the priest is attached to the diocese goes way back. That's kind of a ancient canonical principle with the expectation that you would have, again, talking about tenure with rectors, you were ordained a priest in a diocese really with the expectation of a lifetime tenure, right? A lifetime tenure in that diocese. Uh, Perhaps serving as a, typical career path might be something like a curacy, and then you'd be called to a rector. Then you might be called to another rectorship, but really, I remember one old priest in the Diocese of New York in my last parish just saying it was like a marriage. You were called for life. You became the rector, and you were expected to stay until you died. And that was the thinking. And so even back in the day, same with the bishops. It was you didn't leave one episcopate to go to another episcopate. There was a case in New York a few years ago where a bishop, I think from a Midwestern diocese, became the rector of St. Bart's on Park Avenue, and that's a kind of sort of canonical. It's not. I can't think of how that violates the canon, but it certainly goes against the spirit of the Episcopal Church. So the idea of a priest being attached to the diocese was very sort of and one of the anchor principles of
Mhm.
Episcopalianism. But there were certainly occasions, particularly as we were a expanding missionary church um, going west in the 19th century, where they needed clergy, and so they would call men from back east if they could get them to come. And so there needed to be a process for removing a priest from one diocese to another. And so there's this idea of, you know, you're ordained a priest for the entire church, but the bishop would give you a letter saying you were, in good standing, there was nothing wrong with you, and the bishop, wherever you were going, would accept it. That was called the letter de missae, from the Latin being sent. Uh, this is not an opportunity to go through the ordination process again. This is not you being reordained. This is not you going through commission on ministry and discernment, right? I mean, you're a
Right.
priest. And so the canons say that the receiving bishop shall accept the letters de miserae, not may accept, not, has 60 days to raise an objection. It's
Hmm.
shall accept. And where I have heard people, particularly bishops or transition ministers, what I've heard them say is, particularly after this article was published, and I pointed out that, if a parish in another diocese called me and the bishop didn't like me, tough. And I had bishops tell me, I had canons to the ordinary tell me, oh, well, we would just wouldn't accept the letter de miserae. Well, again, that's not canonical. There is a provision in the canon, and as sometimes happens when these transitions take place, that something comes up that wasn't previously known, some dark skeleton comes to life. I can think of a few examples where men, one fellow in particular ran for bishop and an affair was discovered. I think that's
Hmm.
happened more than once. And if he hadn't run for bishop, he probably would have never been discovered. But the process of running for bishop shed light onto that. And so I think, yes, of course, in the process of going from one diocese to another, there's an opportunity there for things to come to light, and the canons allow for that. I mean, if there is something that would speak against a priest's faith and morals, then sure, the letter de miserae need not be accepted. But at that point, it's probably bad enough that the letter de miserae would be rescinded anyway,
Hmm.
and because the letter de miserae is basically saying this is a priest in good standing. There's nothing,
Right.
so there's so that process, I think, is another area of abuse. And I see where that. So what will happen a lot of times is that search committees or vestries will be given a list of, and you'll hear transition officers talk about this. You can have a guided search or a directed search, I think it's called, or you can do your own search. And the directed search is the bishop gives you a pre-approved list, and you can pick one, and he'll appoint the priest as priest in charge, and then if you like each other, you can call the person as rector. I actually have no
Hmm.
problem with that if that's how all parties agree. If all parties agree that this is okay and we want to do it this way because we don't have the bandwidth, to actually organize a search committee and do a national search or whatever, I have no problem with that. What the problem is that becomes the norm, or the problem is that is used as a way to erode the rights of the three orders of the church, or the two
Hmm.
in this case.
Absolutely. Um, you going back to the letters demissory issue, I feel like if my recollection is correct, that there's only, I mean, you have to be a priest in good standing in the Episcopal Church, which means I think there's three things that are foundational to that. Maybe and that outside of that, if there's any personal animus from either bishop, that really they cannot um, rescind that or not accept it or refuse to issue letters.
That well,
Um,
yeah, I think you're right. That's what the canons say. And if there is a true issue with the priest, that's what Title IV is. That's what the disciplinary process is for.
mhm,
What I think is happening is we're not getting to the point where letters de miserae are being issued and then being refused. The sort of, old boy and girl network. And I remember when I was working on staff at 815, attending a conference of what was it called? The Conference of Diocesan Executives, which was the canons to the ordinary.
okay.
And, like all things Episcopalian, you go to the conference and then you end up at the hotel bar, after the day's done, and you trade stories. And I remember one canon to the ordinary describing the dead cats. And I said, what are the dead cats? And he said, well, those are the priests nobody wants, right? And so, part of what they do at these conferences is trade dead cats, right? Or they flag the dead cats, right? We'll take this dead cat for your dead cat kind of thing. But the idea is that they're already, you've got this network of bishops and transition officers and canons to the ordinary that are in conversation. So you never get to the point where a letter de miserae is issued and then rejected, because the transition officers have already talked to each other and said, well, don't even bother with that one.
Hmm. Right.
And then, and this is where a parish is just totally in the dark because they're not even going to ever
Right.
know the name of that person. And unless they're
Right.
very sophisticated and have a lot of money and they can really afford to do a national search or hire a consultant to do it or have a network that they want, or they have somebody really in mind. And this was the case for me with this church that I'm thinking of where the bishop intervened. This was a 1928 prayer book parish, right? One of the last.
Wow.
And, they had a very narrow definition of the kind of priest they were looking for. And I fit it.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
this is a real tragedy because they weren't, that parish, like so many, will probably, you know, linger on, and last I heard will probably close at some point. So, you know, this is having the if the intent if the desired effect is really to force conservatives, what's left of them in the Episcopal Church, or what's left of something like the 1928 prayer book, the witness to that tradition. If the
Mhm.
intended purpose here is to really drive that out, it's having the intended effect.
Yeah. Well, that kind of brings me to my next question or topic, which is the bishop's role. We've hit on it a little bit, but um, you did note that the bishop may refuse to consent to the election in the article. And so that's different from directing the search.
Right.
And so what what do you think the theological logic is behind that structure, or why is that distinction important?
So my recollection is that the national canons do not allow the bishop to refuse consent. It's not a consent process. It's more of
Hmm.
an advice process.
Hmm.
I'm going to give you my honest opinion about this person. Now I have read diocesan canons that have a more spelled out procedure. And one in particular I'm thinking of says that the bishop may object, but then it goes back to the vestry to come back with a unanimous override, right? So, I mean, the vestry can still even override that objection. That's not a national canon. That was a local canon in one diocese that I'm thinking of in particular. And I'm not even sure that that would stand because, just as the parish bylaws accede to the diocesan canons and the diocesan canons accede to the national canons should be, there's a idea of supremacy, right? So the
Right.
national canons should be supreme. And my recollection is that the canons do not, give the bishop any kind of plenary authority to veto a vestry election.
Yeah.
So I think what you're getting at or what you're asking is what's the actual role then in the search process for a bishop to play? And I think that the role is to advise. And if you think back to the idea that, originally before there was all this moving around, that each diocese was really kind of its own closed system. There was a limited pool of priests. And, you know, there wasn't, in order the number of priests eligible or in transition at any minute at any point was relatively small. And so you know, I think there is the idea the bishops really knew their priests, right? So if you've got an Anglo-Catholic parish and Jake Dell is known as a low church Protestant evangelical, that the bishop might say, well, he's a good preacher, but he probably doesn't look too good in a chasuble. And you could say that to the parish, and they would say, okay, thanks for letting us know. Do you know anybody who can do is would be more suited for us? And bishop could say yes. So I think that's the advisory role. I mean, that's when the system is working right. That's what it's supposed to do, is try to match the right priest with the right parish.
Sure. Well, this is um my goodness. This is really interesting. And I just don't I think that what you're talking about is that the diocesan canons accede to the national canons, and that there's this idea, there's a political philosophy called subsidiarity,
Right.
which is that if things need to be taken care of at the kind of lowest, most local level possible. And in my understanding, all of the canons in the Episcopal Church really give that power back to the parishes, to the
Hmm.
laity.
Hmm.
And so it's really shocking to hear that there are certain maybe policies or customs in certain bishops' dioceses that are going against that,
Well,
essentially, which
yeah,
is
it's kind of managerialism, right? And so
right.
you have the canons, but as you say, who wants to read those? And so if somebody comes along who's called they used to call them deployment officers, but transition officer now, and says, "Oh, well, here's the handbook of best practices," right?
Mhm.
And it's in a easy PowerPoint presentation, then that's what you're going to follow.
Mhm.
And who wants to rock the boat, right? If you're a warden or a vestryman who reads the canons, you're like, okay, well, okay, I don't see any harm in going along with these best practices. And I would say probably in a lot of cases it works just fine. I mean, the pool of candidates is acceptable to the congregation and to the search committee and to the vestry, and it's a happy arrangement. But where when it falls down, or how it falls down, is I think in is where the abuse can start to creep in. And over
Right.
time, if you just let a vestry get used to being told what the best practices are by a quote
Yeah.
unquote professional in transition, in other words, if you let the church be managed by the church managers,
Mhm.
then you really lose the biblical and theological aspect of what you're called to do. You're called to be a member of Christ's body. And you've talked about this on the podcast. You're called to exercise that. It's just the priesthood of all believers. You're called to exercise that through taking your, proper role in the deliberations and councils of the church. And we've ordered that in such a way that bishops do one thing, priests do another, and laity and vestries do another. And
Mhm.
if we all just, and you see this with bishops too, with the ordination process, everything gets offloaded to the commissions on ministry, right? It's no, bishop, it's your job to raise up the next generation of preachers and priests in your diocese, right? I mean that you're the one, you have the spiritual authority. We've given that to you, not a committee or commission. So
Right. Well, that makes me want to ask you a little bit about the theology behind all of that and taking it just kind of stepping back from the canons because essentially we're Christians and all of this has to accede to the gospel.
mhm.
And so what, in your opinion, what is the theological purpose of the Episcopal authority? Is it guarding our doctrine, making sure we have unity across our parishes? How do you see Episcopal authority?
I think it was my understanding of it was that it was to guard the faith and unity of the church,
Hmm.
um, meaning that they were really responsible for who gets ordained, right?
Right.
And that is probably the heaviest spiritual responsibility that any bishop has. But for that pro for that but for that authority to be basically subsumed by a process, so that candidates are passed along from vestry to commission to standing committee, and then they show up at an ordination ceremony, and the bishop really may or may not want to ordain or not know this person. That's they've ceded their spiritual authority there. So I think
Mhm.
that's part of one reason why the unit, if you don't guard the church there, you're going to eventually lose the unity of the church a generation later. Um, and so I think, yes, that's why we have bishops, is to guard the doctrine and discipline and the unity of the church. And in my more cynical moments, I have despaired of the fact that, the bishops had one job, guard the faith and the unity of the church, and they haven't done it.
Yeah.
The church is not united. Um, and I would say it's lost in many examples, its faith.
Yeah. Yeah. What you've described here today on the podcast is absolutely um, not doing those things, right? We're not guarding the doctrine. We're not guarding the unity across the parishes. It's not just about pastoral oversight and being the shepherd to the shepherds. It's that they've more become institutional managers and guarding the institution.
Well, right.
That's what it sounds like you've described here. And it seems like when that oversight becomes too centralized, then the health of the local congregation really suffers.
I think that's right. I mean, and it's not centralized in one person, which is what you would think the
Mm,
episcopacy was all about. It's centralized in a process.
hmm
I mean, the canons are actually set up for the most part very well. You have a bishop with quasi-monarchical powers, but held in check by a standing committee. You have a rector who, with again, well, the word literally means ruler, right? So with monarchical powers in the parish, but held in check by the vestry and the bishop, right? You're not going to introduce a strange form of worship that doesn't conform to the Book of Common Prayer. At least, of course, that broke down too, right? So, you had clergy doing whatever they wanted. Um,
Yeah. Yeah. If okay, so maybe a little, if you have a minute, just some
Sure.
practical advice for people in governance on vestries.
Right.
If someone believes that the process, if they're in a search process and they believe that process is drifting away from what the canons describe, what do you recommend they do?
This is hard, and this article has taken on a life of its own. I mean, I wrote it when I was still a priest in the Episcopal Church with no intention of leaving.
Yeah.
And I'm actually I'm sad to have left. I never wanted to leave, right? And so, but the article has taken on a life of its own, and I get calls, emails from priests or search committees in years later, years after this article.
Yeah.
Um, and I think the advice I tend to give is after I listen to where the person or the committee's at, just as tailored to the situation as I can make it. Pastorally speaking, if you're a priest in charge and you like your parish and they like you and the bishop is leaving you alone, fine. I mean, you're doing the Lord's work. And it's, so that, that's a bit of advice I recently gave to someone. Um, Search committees, vestries, I would say, what are the leverage points here? First of all, understand your terms. If the transition officer comes and says, you can do a guided or a directed search, understand you're giving up a lot of rights there. You can always claw them back. You're not giving them up irrevocably. Um, and but understand what that means. Understand that if you have a priest in charge, you may be paying that person. You may think that that is your priest, and it is, but understand who he or she belongs to. That person serves at the pleasure of the bishop, and that's worth
Yeah.
thinking about when you understand that. So it's worth maybe having that conversation with the search committee, with the vestry, with the candidate. Are you okay being a priest in charge? Do you want to be rector? What is why are you settling for this? Or is this, do you see yourself as an interim? Or how what is this? And then I think, straightforward conversation with the transition officer or even the bishop, you know, explain to us why we can't do what the canons say.
Right.
In my own case, I think it was, again, I think there's a hostility to certainly 1928 prayer book parishes are a dinosaur at this point,
Sure.
fossils, not even. I can think of two or three. Anyone who's sort of, against women's ordination,
hmm
anyone who doesn't want gay marriage or doesn't want LGBT or doesn't want the rainbow flag, right? I mean, these are the pain points. So if you're a relatively conservative church still, and I know there are many, and you don't want that, this is where you're going to be getting the resistance. Because if you manage to find a conservative priest who isn't canonically resident in your diocese, um, this is where this is where the process will be applied against you. So my advice at that point would be to this is going to sound aggressive, but I would say the vestry should hire a lawyer and have counsel present during the hiring process that an outside third party legal person engaged in this. That's another thing that's important to understand. The bishop has a chancellor.
Right.
That is not the parish's lawyer. That is not
Right.
the clergy's lawyer. That is the bishop's lawyer. So if the bishop can have a lawyer, and I remember being in a meeting with the bishop once, and chancellor was sitting right behind him, and I was glad I had my lawyer there that day too.
Yeah.
Even though it was like, well, why are you bringing a lawyer? Because you have a lawyer, bishop. And so
Right.
Matthew 18 aside, if the bishop's going to have a lawyer, then the vestry ought to have a lawyer. And
Yeah.
maybe even the candidate for rector ought to have a lawyer.
Sure.
Because I'm sure the CEO of General Motors negotiates, is it Marion Barbara now? I'm sure she negotiated her pay package, her salary agreement with an attorney. So
Right.
get used to that idea. But that costs money, and a lot of these churches are struggling, don't have the war chest to do that. And so that's when things like directed searches look appealing.
Right. Well, it's good advice. And I, Pastor Dale, I really appreciate you bringing clarity to this topic. I think it takes a lot of courage to write about that. And I think that this topic often operates in the background of church
Mhm.
life. Understanding how authority and responsibility are meant to function is important for governance. It's important for good churchmanship
Mhm.
and for the spiritual health of all of our congregations. So thank you very much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
No, you're welcome. I was glad to do it. Yeah. All right. Let me see if I can.